On July 25, 1943, Benito Mussolini walked into a royal audience still believing he could manage the crisis around him. Allied armies had landed in Sicily. Rome had been bombed. Italian soldiers were tired, civilians were hungry, and even fascist insiders could see that the war was moving from distant fronts into the body of Italy itself. But the public image of the Duce had been built over 20 years to look unbreakable. He had spoken from balconies, bullied institutions, absorbed the monarchy into his theater of power, and taught the country to imagine that fascism and Mussolini were the same thing. The unresolved question that afternoon was severe. Could a dictatorship centered on one man be made to stop by the very insiders who had helped build it? The cause of the crisis was not one secret meeting. It was accumulated defeat. In May, Axis forces in North Africa had surrendered. In July, Operation Husky put Allied troops on Sicily. Bombing raids over Italian cities, including Rome, made propaganda promises feel hollow. The war that Mussolini had entered for empire and prestige now threatened the monarchy, the army, the party hierarchy, and ordinary families. King Victor Emmanuel III had lived with fascism for 2 decades, sometimes resenting Mussolini and sometimes depending on him. By late July, the king and his advisors feared that if Mussolini remained, the monarchy might fall with him. Inside the fascist elite, Dino Grandi turned that fear into emotion. Grandi had been part of the system, not an outside revolutionary. That matters because the fall of Mussolini did not begin as a democratic uprising in a parliament. It began as a Palestine party maneuver by men trying to rescue authority from a leader they now saw as a liability. Grandi's order of the day asked that constitutional military powers be restored to the king. On paper, that could sound procedural. In practice, it attacked the personal mechanism of the dictatorship. If the king resumed command, Mussolini would no longer be the indispensable wartime chief. On the evening of July 24th, the Grand Council of Fascism met for the first time in years. The rarity of the meeting was itself evidence of emergency. Around the table sat men who knew the regime from the inside: Grandi, Galeazzo Ciano, Roberto Farinacci, and others who had served, flattered, feared, or profited from Mussolini. Ciano was Mussolini's son-in-law, which made his choice especially dangerous. The debate lasted deep into the night because everyone in the room understood that a vote was no longer symbolic. It would measure whether fear of Mussolini was still stronger than fear of national collapse. Mussolini argued, maneuvered, and tried to hold the room by force of habit. For years his performance had mattered: the voice, the posture, the certainty, the demand that others orbit him. But July 1943 had changed what listeners could believe. Sicily was invaded, German power inside Italy was growing, bomb damage and military failure were facts no speech could erase. When the vote finally came, loyalty became countable. 19 members backed Grandi's motion, 7 opposed it. Mussolini had not been physically removed, but he had been outvoted by his own fascist council. The personal myth had cracked in the room built to sustain it. The next morning was dangerous because the public still did not know the center had given way. A dictatorship can look normal for a few hours after its pillars have moved. The king's household prepared an audience at Villa Savia for that afternoon. From the outside, it looked like another wartime report to the monarch. That appearance was useful. Mussolini arrived expecting to explain the council meeting and continue governing. He found a king who had already decided that survival required dismissal. Victor Emmanuel was small in stature and often cautious in politics, but in that meeting he carried the authority Mussolini had never fully abolished. According to accounts of the encounter, the king told Mussolini that the war was going badly and that Marshal Pietro Badoglio would replace him as head of government. The words converted a vast public dictatorship into a private dismissal. Mussolini protested that the vote was advisory and that he still served Italy. But the decision had already moved beyond argument. The monarch, the army command, and anti-Mussolini fascist insiders had converged. What remained was the physical act. Carabinieri waited outside. To avoid a public fight or a rescue attempt, Mussolini was steered into a vehicle under the pretext of protection. The detail is important because dictatorships often end in practical arrangements as much as declarations. A gate opens, a guard steps forward, a car door closes. The man who had filled squares with choreographed obedience left the royal residence as a prisoner. In minutes, Mussolini moved from command to custody. That evening, Badoglio announced the change. The official language was careful. The king had accepted Mussolini's resignation and appointed a new government. Many Italians heard the deeper meaning anyway. In parts of Rome and other cities, crowds tested the news by tearing down fascist symbols or celebrating cautiously. Yet relief was mixed with fear because the war had not ended. Badoglio declared that Italy would continue fighting. Behind that phrase lay a dangerous reality. The new government wanted space to negotiate with the Allies while avoiding immediate German retaliation. Germany reacted with suspicion. Hitler understood that Mussolini's fall threatened the Axis position in southern Europe. Italian soldiers and officials now faced contradictory signals: obey the king, watch the Germans, continue a war that many believed was lost, and wait for decisions not yet announced. The armistice with the Allies would come in September, and its announcement would unleash occupation, resistance, reprisals, and civil war. Mussolini himself would be moved through detention sites before German commandos rescued him from Campo Imperator and installed him as the head of the Italian Social Republic in the north. His fall on July 25th was not the clean end of violence. That is why the event matters. Mussolini's arrest did not instantly free Italy from war or fascism. It did something narrower and still enormous. It proved that the Duce was not identical with the state. He could be outvoted, dismissed, guarded, and transported away. The regime he built had depended on spectacle, fear, and the claim that alternatives were impossible. In July 1943, defeat made obedience more dangerous than betrayal for the men closest to power. A motion in the night, a king's audience in the afternoon, and a waiting police detail turned the myth of permanence into a custody problem. The fall of Mussolini is therefore not only a story about one dictator losing office. It is a story about how personal power can appear immovable until institutions and insiders calculate that it has become a threat to their own survival. It also warns that removing a dictator is not the same as repairing a country. Italy still faced German occupation, Allied invasion, political revenge, and civil conflict. But on July 25, 1943, one crucial sentence became visible. The man who claimed to embody Italy could be separated from Italy. The door of the vehicle closed, and the age of Mussolini as untouchable ruler was over.